The rain had just stopped over Cedar Hollow, and beneath an old oak tree, a little girl whispered to the flowers, "Mom, are you watching us?" Her father, once broken by grief, stood nearby, unsure whether the tears on his face belonged to sorrow or to healing. But that day, something changed. A secret long buried would rise again, carried by a letter, a storm, and the courage to forgive. Before we begin this heartfelt story, tell me, where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments, and may your day be filled with peace, love, and the gentle miracles that still bloom after every storm. The rain never really stopped in Cedar Hollow. It didn't fall hard enough to flood the roads, but it lingered like a thought that refused to leave, whispering against the wooden eaves of the houses scattered through the misty valley. Every morning, fog would slide down from the pines, curling around rooftops, wrapping the town in a quiet stillness that felt both holy and haunted. The Cole residence stood on the edge of town, a two-story cedar house with peeling paint and a porch that creaked with every wind gust. It was built by Daniel Cole's own hands a decade ago, back when laughter still lived inside those walls. Now, the laughter was gone, replaced by the hum of rain and the occasional bark of his dog, Ranger. Officer Daniel Cole was 38, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of posture that came from years in uniform. His dark hair had started to gray at the temples, not from age, but from grief. His blue eyes, once sharp with the curiosity of a small-town cop, had dulled into a permanent squint, as if the world itself had become too bright to face directly. A scar crossed the knuckle of his right hand, a memory from his time in the K-9 unit. He wore his badge even when he didn't have to. Perhaps it was habit, perhaps it was armor. Since the death of his wife Amelia 2 years earlier, Daniel had become a man of rituals. Wake before dawn, pour black coffee, scratch Ranger's head once, and leave before the sun rose. Work had become his sanctuary, the only place that didn't echo with memories. Ranger, his German shepherd, was 5 years old, a sturdy male with black and tan fur that gleamed even in the gray light. His amber eyes held an alertness that never slept. Once, he had served alongside Daniel in search and rescue operations. Now, his job was quieter, to guard a house that had stopped needing protection. He had the solemn dignity of a soldier who understood loss. When Daniel was gone, Ranger would sit by the front window for hours, ears twitching at every sound, as though waiting for an order that would never come. Inside the house, Leela, Daniel's 8-year-old daughter, moved like a ghost through her own home. She had her mother's chestnut hair and her father's solemn eyes, a combination that made her look both wise and heartbreakingly young. Each morning, she woke to the sound of the rain and the distant rumble of her father's truck pulling out of the driveway. She'd brush her tangled hair into a ponytail, button her uniform shirt with small, careful fingers, and eat her cereal in silence. Her mother had once filled these mornings with songs and pancakes. Now, breakfast was a ritual of survival. Lila never complained, never asked questions. She had learned early that words could echo too loudly in an empty house. In the kitchen, Mabel, their neighbor, sometimes came by to check on Lila. Mabel was in her 60s with soft gray curls and hands roughened by years of gardening. She smelled, faintly of lavender and cinnamon, like a grandmother the world had forgotten to give Lila. "Your father works too hard," she would mutter, as she stirred cocoa on the stove, her eyes gentle but sad. Lila would only smile faintly, as if afraid that kindness might disappear if she acknowledged it. The town of Cedar Hollow itself was small enough that everyone knew when Daniel came and went. Locals whispered that he hadn't smiled since the funeral. Some pitied him. Others simply let him be. The town had learned that grief was contagious in small places. On this particular morning, the rain was softer than usual, falling like a curtain of glass beads. Daniel stood on the porch, coffee steaming in his hand, watching the mist rise from the treetops. Ranger sat beside him, tail still, eyes focused on something unseen. "Another day, partner," Daniel murmured. The dog gave a low rumble of acknowledgement. Inside, Lila was tying her shoes, humming so faintly that the sound barely existed. It was the same melody Amelia once played on the piano, a melody Daniel could no longer bear to hear. At the police station, Daniel buried himself in paperwork and calls. He wasn't a detective in a bustling city, Cedar Hollow's biggest crimes were broken headlights and teenage pranks. Yet he moved with the intensity of a man chasing something dangerous. Maybe not a criminal, but his own thoughts. His colleagues respected him, even admired his discipline, but they knew better than to ask about his family. Back home, Ranger guarded Lila with the quiet devotion of a sentinel. When she returned from school, soaked from the drizzle, he'd meet her at the door, shaking off rain onto the rug. She'd giggle softly, the rare sound that could still break through the gloom. Together, they'd sit by the fireplace, she reading from an old storybook, he resting his head on her knees. It was their silent pact, two souls surviving the absence of warmth by sharing what little they had left. That evening, Daniel arrived late. The rain had intensified, drumming against the roof like restless fingers. The living room was dark except for the flickering light from the fireplace. Ranger lifted his head, but didn't move. Lila had fallen asleep on the couch, book open on her chest. Daniel stood in the doorway for a long moment, his throat tightening. The sight of her sleeping reminded him painfully of Amelia, how she used to fall asleep the same way, half-finished novels slipping from her hands. He approached quietly, brushing a strand of hair from Lila's forehead. Her small hand twitched, seeking warmth. He hesitated, then let his palm rest on her head, a tentative gesture that felt like trespassing. Ranger's tail thumped softly against the rug, as if to encourage him. "You should be asleep in your bed, sweetheart," he whispered, but he didn't move her. He just sat down beside the couch and watched the fire die to embers. When the clock struck 11, Daniel's radio buzzed, a call from dispatch about a traffic accident on Route 9. He rose, grabbed his jacket, and turned to Ranger. "Stay," he said softly. The dog whined, sensing his exhaustion, but obeying. As Daniel stepped into the storm, the wind hit him like cold breath. He had always been brave in danger, but tonight the emptiness scared him more than any call could. Hours later, long past midnight, the house remained awake in its own way. Rain lashed against the windows, the clock ticked, and somewhere in the dark, Lila stirred from sleep. She padded into the kitchen for water, her small feet making no sound on the wooden floor. Ranger followed, his nails clicking faintly. She poured the water carefully, not wanting to spill a drop. In that tiny act of control lay all her fear of disappointing anyone. When Daniel returned at dawn, soaked and exhausted, the first thing he saw through the fogged window was Ranger watching him, eyes gleaming amber in the gray light. The dog wagged once, slow and dignified. Inside, the house smelled of rain, smoke, and something fragile, like hope trying to be reborn. Daniel paused on the porch, hand on the doorknob, feeling a strange pull in his chest. He didn't know that this morning would mark the beginning of change, subtle and unstoppable, carried quietly by the same rain that had haunted their lives for years. He looked up at the sky, muttering, "You just won't let up, will you?" The rain answered with a soft hiss on the pine needles. Inside, Lila stirred awake, Ranger at her side. The house, once lifeless, seemed to breathe again, slowly, hesitantly, like a heart remembering how to beat. The next morning came wrapped in silver fog, the kind that blurred the edges of everything, trees, roads, even memories. The rain had softened overnight, now just a whisper on the leaves outside the coal house. Inside, the smell of toast and burnt coffee drifted faintly through the kitchen. Daniel stood at the counter, half awake, uniform shirt unbuttoned at the collar. His daughter Lila sat at the table, tracing circles on her cup of milk with a spoon, pretending not to notice how tired her father looked. Ranger rested by the door, his ears twitching at every drip of water outside. The radio crackled softly with the morning news. It was Saturday, Daniel's one day off, but days off rarely meant rest. The house had grown dusty, the porch steps sagged, and the piano Amelia once played still sat silent, covered by a thin film of dust. He had promised himself a dozen times to fix it, but every time he looked at the keys, his chest tightened. He poured another cup of coffee instead. "You'll be late for art class," he said, not looking up. Lila nodded, slipping off her chair, her ponytail bouncing as she grabbed her small raincoat from the hook. Cedar Hollow's main street was still quiet when they arrived. The sky hung low, the clouds brushing the roofs like smoke. Daniel parked near the community center, walked Lila to the entrance, and kissed the top of her head, a rare gesture that caught her by surprise. "Be good, kiddo," he murmured. She smiled shyly, nodding. Ranger watched from the car window, tail tapping against the seat, as if counting the seconds until she returned. While waiting, Daniel decided to grab coffee at the diner across the street. That's where he saw her, Sarah Whitmore. She was standing at the corner table, helping an elderly woman gather spilled sugar packets. She wore a long gray raincoat that looked too big for her, sleeves slightly frayed at the cuffs. Her hair, the color of wet sand, was tied back in a loose bun, and her eyes, hazel with flecks of green, carried a kind of fatigue that didn't belong to her age. She looked 30, maybe 32, tall but slightly stooped, as though the world had been heavy on her shoulders for a long time. When she turned, Daniel recognized her instantly. "Sarah?" he asked, uncertain. She blinked, startled, then smiled faintly. "Officer Cole," she said quietly, her voice soft but steady. "It's been a while." Sarah Whitmore had once worked as a nurse at Cedar Hollow General Hospital, the same place Amelia spent her final months. Back then, Sarah had been bright, gentle, always humming as she moved from bed to bed. But now her voice carried an invisible crack, the kind that comes from too many nights spent apologizing to ghosts. A storm 3 years ago had changed her life. She'd lost a patient because she left her shift early to care for her own sick mother. The guilt had never left. Since then, she avoided hospitals, taking odd jobs, and volunteering instead, as if she could heal herself through quiet service. They spoke awkwardly at first, about the weather, about how small Cedar Hollow still was, about the town's upcoming fall festival. But beneath the words was something unspoken, a shared memory neither dared to touch. When she mentioned that she was between jobs, Daniel hesitated. "Lila could use some company after school," he said slowly. "I've been busy with work. If you're looking for something part-time, just a few hours a day, it might help both of you." Sarah's fingers tightened around her coffee mug. "I'm not sure I'd be good with children," she admitted. Daniel shrugged. "You were good with everyone else." His tone was kind but distant, like a man trying not to hope too much. After a moment, she nodded. "All right," she said. "I'll try." That afternoon, the rain began again. Not heavy, but steady enough to make the pine needles glisten. Daniel drove Sarah to the house. She sat quietly in the passenger seat, clutching her gray coat, her gaze drifting to the mist curling through the forest. "You still live out near the ridge?" she asked softly. "Yeah, same place," Daniel replied. "It's quieter there." Sarah smiled faintly. "I remember. Amelia used to talk about how much she loved the sound of rain on that porch." Her voice trembled slightly at the name, and Daniel gripped the steering wheel harder. Ranger, sitting upright in the back seat, tilted his head toward her, sniffing the air cautiously. When they reached the house, Sarah stepped out first. The smell of wet cedar filled the air. She paused, taking in the porch, the garden overrun with weeds, the half-covered piano visible through the window. "It feels," she started, then stopped herself, "like time hasn't moved." Daniel gave a small nod. "That's kind of the problem." Inside, Ranger followed her every movement. His fur bristled slightly as she walked through the hallway, though his tail stayed low, a soldier's suspicion, not aggression. "He's protective," Daniel said, half apologetic. Sarah crouched slightly, meeting the dog's gaze. "You're a beautiful one, aren't you?" she whispered. Ranger didn't growl. He simply watched her, amber eyes unreadable, before retreating to his post by the window. When Lila came home that evening, her father introduced them. Sarah smiled, but it wasn't the easy practice smile of an adult trying to impress a child. It was smaller, almost hesitant. "Hello, Lila," she said. "I heard you like to draw." Lila nodded, clutching her school bag. "Mom did too," she said softly. The words hung in the air like fragile glass. Sarah's expression faltered for a heartbeat, before she crouched to meet Lila's eyes. "Then, I think I'll like your drawings very much." Dinner that night was quiet, but less empty than usual. Sarah helped set the table, her movements careful and deliberate. She didn't talk much, just observed, occasionally asking Lila about school. Ranger sat beside her chair, alert but calm, as if deciding whether to trust this new presence. Outside, The rain pattered against the windows, turning the glass into a moving painting. Later, after Lila went to bed, Daniel walked Sarah to the porch. "I appreciate your help," he said. "It's been difficult keeping things steady." Sarah nodded, wrapping her coat tighter around her. "Sometimes," she said, "steady isn't the same as alive." Her words lingered in the air long after she left. When Daniel returned inside, Ranger was still by the door, watching the night. He placed a hand on the dog's head. "What do you think, buddy?" he murmured. Ranger's ears flicked. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the hills. Upstairs, Lila stirred in her sleep. She dreamed of her mother's voice mixing with the sound of rain, soft, distant, like a melody remembered from another life. Downstairs, the piano sat untouched, but something had changed in the air. The rain no longer sounded mournful. It sounded like breathing. The following week brought a stretch of gray skies that never quite broke into rain. The air felt heavy with promises the weather couldn't keep. In Cedar Hollow, that kind of stillness meant the town held its breath. At the coal house, though, the quiet had taken on a new texture, no longer suffocating, but uncertain, like the silence before a song. Sarah had settled into her part-time role smoothly, perhaps too smoothly. Each morning she arrived precisely at 8, her gray raincoat buttoned to the throat, hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck. She moved with the grace of someone used to hospital corridors, efficient, precise, and strangely detached. Daniel noticed it the first few days. Sarah's steps were measured, her hands never idle. She cleaned surfaces already clean, organized drawers no one used, and folded napkins as if their edges could hold the household together. Her face rarely revealed emotion. Even when she smiled, it was the kind that never quite reached her eyes. The only time she seemed to soften was around Lila. Yet even then her kindness carried a faint restraint, like a hand hovering over a flame. Lila, for her part, had begun to adjust to Sarah's presence. She was curious about this quiet woman who always spoke in low tones, who never interrupted, never scolded. Sarah praised her drawings, carefully, formally, like a teacher reviewing homework. "Very neat lines," she would say. "You have good control." Lila wasn't sure what that meant, but she liked the sound of approval, even if it came wrapped in distance. Ranger, however, remained cautious. He followed Sarah everywhere, his nails clicking softly against the floorboards, eyes alert, ears flicking whenever she moved too fast. Sarah didn't mind him. In fact, she spoke to him more than she spoke to Daniel. "You and I understand order, don't we?" she once whispered while refilling his water bowl. Ranger tilted his head, then lay down with a low sigh, as if acknowledging her truth. One afternoon, Mabel, the elderly neighbor, stopped by unannounced with a basket of blueberry muffins. Mabel's face, framed by her curls, was lined with the kind of warmth that time couldn't erase. Her cheerful voice filled the kitchen like sunlight sneaking through the clouds. "I thought you might use a bit of sweetness in this house," she said, setting the basket on the table. "Lord knows the rain's been hoarding it all." Sarah thanked her politely, her posture straight, her hands folded. Mabel studied her with curiosity. "You must be the helper Daniel mentioned. You've got steady eyes, I'll give you that. But don't let steadiness turn into stone." Sarah blinked, unsure how to respond. "I'll keep that in mind," she said finally, her tone respectful but distant. When Mabel left, the scent of muffins lingered in the air like something both comforting and nostalgic. That evening, Daniel came home earlier than usual. He found Sarah and Lila at the kitchen table, coloring. The sight caught him off guard. Lila bent over her sketchbook, Sarah leaning slightly forward, guiding her hand as she drew the outline of a daisy. "You're home early," Sarah said without looking up. Her tone was calm, professional, but there was a faint surprise in her eyes. "Paperwork finished faster than I thought," Daniel replied. His voice softened as he turned to his daughter. "Hey, sweetheart, that's beautiful." Lila's face brightened, and for a moment, the room felt alive. Later, after dinner, Sarah began tidying the kitchen. She wiped every surface twice, straightened the chairs, then rearranged the silverware drawer Daniel had already organized. "Everything has its place," she murmured under her breath. "If you keep things where they belong, they don't disappear." Daniel leaned against the doorway, watching her. "You don't have to do all that every night," he said gently. Sarah paused, then gave a small, almost guilty smile. Old habits, she replied. Hospitals teach you to control what you can. The next morning, the first real conflict came, not through words, but through rhythm. Lila spilled her orange juice. It was nothing, really, a clumsy moment every child has. But the way Sarah froze made the air tighten. She stared at the spreading puddle like it was a wound. You should be more careful, she said quietly. Her voice wasn't sharp, but it carried an edge that made Lila's small shoulders stiffen. Daniel, reading the tension, stepped in quickly. It's fine. It's just juice. Sarah hesitated before nodding, grabbing a towel, and cleaning up every last drop. She pressed so hard against the counter that her knuckles went white. Ranger, lying nearby, growled softly, an almost imperceptible warning. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. The sound of the rain had returned, tapping gently on the roof. He sat by the window, watching the reflection of lightning ripple over the wet glass. Ranger lay beside him, head on his paws, eyes half open. Something's off, isn't it? Daniel murmured. Ranger's ears twitched. She means well, he continued, but she's fragile. The dog made a small sound, neither agreement nor denial. Downstairs, the faint glow of the kitchen light leaked through the stairwell. Sarah was still awake. She sat at the table, staring at a chipped porcelain cup. Her face, illuminated by the low yellow bulb, looked different, softer but tired beyond words. From her pocket, she pulled a worn photograph. A hospital corridor, fluorescent and cold. Two nurses in scrubs smiled for the camera. One of them was her, years younger, eyes bright. The other was Amelia Cole. Sarah traced the image with her thumb, whispering something only the rain could hear. I didn't mean to leave you. Then she folded the photo carefully, slid it back into her coat, and stood. The next day, the weather broke. Sunshine filtered weakly through the clouds, and for the first time in weeks, the air smelled of pine instead of damp. Daniel offered to drive Sarah home after her shift. On the way, they passed the small town park where Lila used to play before Amelia got sick. The swings moved slightly in the breeze, empty and glinting. She loved that place, Daniel said quietly. Sarah's hands tightened in her lap. I know, she murmured. She told me once, something about the sound of children laughing being proof the world hadn't ended yet. Her words caught Daniel off guard. He looked at her sharply, realizing she remembered more than he thought. When they stopped in front of her small apartment building, a narrow structure with faded paint and flower boxes clinging stubbornly to the windowsills, Sarah turned to him. You don't need to thank me for helping, she said. I'm not doing this out of charity. I just want to be useful again. Daniel nodded, uncertain what to say. She stepped out into the fading light, the gray coat flaring slightly as the wind caught it. Ranger barked once from the back seat, not in alarm, but in recognition. She smiled faintly at him. Good night, soldier. That night, the Cole house was quiet again, but not cold. Daniel found one of Lila's drawings pinned to the fridge. It showed 3 figures under a cloudy sky. A man, a woman, and a child. Between them stood a large dog, tail wagging. He couldn't tell if the woman was Amelia or Sarah, and somehow that didn't matter. The house was no longer empty. It was fragile, imperfect, but alive again. The rain returned to Cedar Hollow 2 days later, sweeping down the valley like an old, familiar ghost. It came softly at first, a mist that clung to the pine needles, then deepened into a steady curtain of gray. Inside the Cole house, the smell of wet earth mingled with the faint scent of coffee and lemon soap. The world outside was blurred, yet within those walls, small details had become sharp. The scrape of Sarah's chair against the floor, the rhythmic sound of her folding Lila's clothes, the low hum Daniel made when he read reports at the kitchen table. The fragile peace they had built in recent days seemed real enough to touch, until the day Ranger found what had been hidden. Ranger had always been more than a dog to Daniel. He was his partner, his silent witness. 5 years of service had trained him to notice the smallest shifts in scent and mood. Lately, he'd been restless. Whenever Sarah entered a room, his ears pricked, and when she left, he sniffed the air as though something in her shadow unsettled him. That morning, Daniel had gone to work early, leaving Ranger to guard the house. Lila sat cross-legged by the fireplace. sketching a picture of Ranger wearing a police badge. Sarah was upstairs, cleaning the guest room, a task she insisted on doing weekly, even though no one ever stayed there. The rain drummed lightly on the roof, and the house felt like it was holding its breath. While Lila drew, Ranger wandered through the hallway, nose twitching. He paused at the foot of the stairs, catching a scent he couldn't place. Something faintly metallic, like ink mixed with dust. His claws clicked against the wooden floor as he followed it up the stairs, each step deliberate. Sarah, humming faintly, didn't hear him at first. She was standing on a stool, reaching to dust the top shelf of an old wardrobe. The stool wobbled slightly under her weight. She wasn't tall, perhaps 5'6", but her frame was thin, the kind that seemed to carry both grace and fragility. Her pale hands moved with precision, the way a nurse prepares instruments before a procedure. Ranger stopped near the foot of the bed, head tilted. His nose brushed the edge of a drawer that was slightly ajar. He nudged it open with his paw. Inside, beneath neatly folded linens, something crackled. He nosed again and pulled free a torn envelope, its paper yellowed and damp at the corners. Sarah froze. For a second, all the color drained from her face. "No," she whispered, stepping off the stool too quickly. It tipped over and hit the floor with a loud clatter. Lila's voice came faintly from below. "Everything okay?" "Yes, sweetheart," Sarah called back, forcing calm into her voice. "Just dropped something." She knelt and took the envelope from Ranger's mouth. Her hands trembled as she turned it over. Across the front, faded ink spelled 2 words. Amelia Cole. Sarah's breath caught. The letter was addressed to a woman who, no longer existed in the world, but who still lived in every corner of this house. She had written it months ago, on the night Amelia died. A letter she never sent, never dared to. Inside were words of apology, confession, and the one secret she'd sworn to bury. She had kept it as a form of punishment, tucked away where she thought no one would find it. But Ranger, loyal and unrelenting, had sensed it all along. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway made her flinch. Daniel was home early. Panic flashed in her eyes. She shoved the envelope into her apron pocket, stood, and hurried downstairs, her expression composed by the time Daniel entered. He looked tired, but lighter somehow. The storm outside seemed smaller than the one he carried within. "You're home early," Sarah said, managing a smile. "Weather's getting rough. Thought I'd finish paperwork here." He hung his jacket by the door. "Everything all right?" he asked. Sarah nodded too quickly. Ranger came down after her, tail low, eyes flicking between them. That evening, as Daniel worked at the kitchen table, Sarah cooked dinner. The smells of garlic and thyme filled the house, warm and comforting. Lila set the table, humming softly. The moment felt almost normal, but Ranger wouldn't sit still. He paced between the kitchen and the hall, his nails tapping in a restless rhythm. At one point, he stopped beside Daniel's chair and gave a short, low bark. "What's the matter, boy?" Daniel asked, scratching his head. Ranger looked toward Sarah, then back to Daniel. Sarah's hand tightened on the wooden spoon she held. "He's probably restless because of the thunder," she said evenly. "It's fine." After dinner, Lila went upstairs to read, and Sarah washed the dishes in silence. The envelope weighed heavily in her pocket. Every few seconds, she glanced toward Daniel, who was writing notes by the lamp. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely audible over the clinking of plates. "Do you ever think about her? About Amelia?" Daniel looked up slowly. "Every day," he said. His tone was calm, but something flickered behind his eyes. "Some days, I think I'm remembering her wrong, like she's slipping away in pieces." Sarah turned off the faucet, drying her hands with care. "She wasn't someone you could forget," she said quietly. "No," he agreed. "She wasn't." The clock ticked. The rain softened to a whisper. Sarah slipped her hand into her pocket, brushing the edge of the letter. "There are things about her last days you might not know," she began, but her voice faltered. Ranger stood, ears rising. Before she could continue, Lila's small voice called from upstairs. "Daddy, can you read with me?" Daniel rose, nodding to Sarah. "Later," he said gently. She nodded, eyes lowered. When he was gone, she took out the envelope and stared at it. The paper was fragile, like it might crumble under the weight of its own guilt. She turned it over, then laid it on the table. For a long time, She simply stared, the ticking clock echoing like a heartbeat. Finally, she whispered, "You were right to find it, boy." Ranger moved closer, resting his head on her knee. She smiled weakly and ran her hand through his fur. "I just don't know if I have the courage to open it again." The following morning, Daniel found the letter. Ranger had carried it to his study, dropping it on top of his paperwork. The name written across the envelope froze him in place. Amelia Cole. His first thought was that someone had sent it years too late, but the handwriting was familiar. Sarah's. His jaw tightened. When she came downstairs moments later, still in her apron, he held the envelope up. "Where did this come from?" Sarah froze mid-step. Her lips parted, but no words came. Ranger stood between them, tail low, head turned as if sensing the weight of something invisible pressing down. "I can explain," Sarah said at last, her voice trembling. But before she could, Lila appeared at the bottom of the stairs, rubbing her eyes. "Daddy?" she asked sleepily. Daniel forced a breath, hiding the letter behind him. "It's nothing, sweetheart. Go get your coat. We'll be late for school." She nodded and padded away. The moment she disappeared, he turned back to Sarah, voice low and sharp. "After I drop her off," he said, "we talk. No more secrets." Sarah's face was pale, but she nodded. "All right." The rain outside had started again, heavier this time, beating against the windows like the echo of a truth demanding to be heard. Ranger sat by the door, watching them both with unblinking eyes. The morning broke cold and restless, the kind of day where even the air felt uncertain of itself. The rain had not stopped since dawn, rolling down the windows of the Cole house in silver threads that blurred the view of the pine forest beyond. Daniel stood in the kitchen, motionless, the letter lying on the table between his hands. His uniform was half-buttoned, his badge glinting faintly under the kitchen light. His coffee had gone cold. He had read the first few lines of the letter only once, but that was enough to feel the floor shift beneath him. It was dated 2 years ago, written the week Amelia died. The words were uneven, hurried, the handwriting trembling. "I left before the storm ended. I thought she was resting. I didn't mean to go. I just couldn't stand the sound of the rain anymore." Daniel's breath caught. The letter wasn't addressed to him, but the name on the envelope, Amelia Cole, told him everything. Sarah's guilt wasn't some vague burden. It was real, carved in ink. She had been the nurse who left Amelia alone on her final night. When Lila came into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes, Daniel folded the letter and tucked it into his jacket. "You ready for school?" he asked, forcing his voice steady. Lila nodded, slipping on her small red raincoat. Ranger patted over, nudging her hand, as if sensing the tension that hung like a storm cloud. She smiled faintly and bent to hug him. "See you later, Ranger," she whispered. Daniel's chest tightened. Even his daughter could sense something was about to break. The drive to the elementary school was quiet. Cedar Hollow's main street was nearly empty except for a few cars and the old postman, Mr. Tucker, who waved from under his dripping hat. Tucker had been delivering letters since before Daniel was born, a small, stooped man with kind eyes and a beard that always smelled faintly of tobacco. As Daniel passed him, the man tipped his hat, unaware that the envelope hidden in Daniel's jacket might as well have been a live wire. After dropping Lila off, Daniel parked the truck outside the small police station. He couldn't go inside. His hands gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles whitened. He sat there listening to the rain drumming against the roof, remembering that night 2 years ago, the call from the hospital, the sterile hallway, the nurse who had already left her shift. He had never seen her face, never asked who she was. Now, that face had been eating at his dinner table for weeks, smiling gently at his daughter, folding her clothes with trembling hands. When he finally drove home, Ranger was waiting on the porch, fur damp, ears perked. The dog barked once, sharp and insistent. Inside, Sarah stood by the window, watching the rain as if waiting for judgment to fall from the clouds. She turned when he entered. Her expression was calm, almost resigned, like someone who had already accepted her sentence. "Where did you get it?" she asked quietly. "Ranger found it," Daniel said. His voice was low, clipped, the way it became when he was trying to hold back anger. "He's good at finding what doesn't belong." Sarah's face twitched at the word belong. She took a slow breath. "You read it." "I did." Silence stretched between them, thick as fog. The rain outside seemed to sync with the rhythm of their breathing. Finally, Daniel spoke. "You left her?" Sarah's eyes shimmered but didn't fall. "Yes." "Why?" Her hands clenched at her sides. "Because I couldn't listen anymore," she said. "The monitors, the thunder, the sound of her calling out for you. It all mixed together. I thought I'd come back after the storm. I thought she'd be safe for an hour. I was wrong." Daniel stared at her, words caught behind his teeth. "You thought she'd be safe," he repeated, his tone flat. "You thought wrong." He turned away, pressing a hand against the wall. "Do you know what it's like, Sarah? To come home to your little girl and tell her mother's not coming back. You were supposed to stay." Sarah swallowed hard. "You think I don't know that?" she said, voice breaking. "You think I haven't replayed that night every day since? I wasn't running from her. I was running from myself. I'd been awake for 30 hours straight. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. The head nurse told me to rest, and I listened. I wanted to believe that meant it was okay." Ranger let out a low growl, not out of aggression, but tension. He moved closer to Daniel, then looked at Sarah as if torn between them. Daniel exhaled heavily. "You should have told me." Sarah nodded slowly. "I wanted to. Every day I walked into this house, I thought about it. But then I saw Lila, and I saw you trying to hold what was left of her world together. I couldn't add more ruin to it." Thunder rolled in the distance, a low, hollow sound that made the windows tremble. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. The anger that had filled him moments ago began to dissolve into exhaustion. He could see now what Ranger had seen all along, the guilt that hung on Sarah's shoulders like a weight she couldn't set down. "I hired you to help my daughter," he said finally, "not to fix my past." Sarah's gaze fell to the floor. "You think I don't know that? But somehow, every time I looked at her, I saw the woman I failed. I wanted to help her laugh again, maybe to believe I could still do something good. But every time she smiled, it hurt." The front door creaked open, and Mabel stepped inside, shaking the rain off her umbrella. "Good heavens," she said, "it's coming down like the end of days." Her cheer faded as she saw their faces. "What happened?" Daniel didn't answer. Sarah whispered, "It's fine, Mabel." Mabel, though frail-looking, had the instincts of a mother who had raised 4 boys and buried 2. Her gray eyes flicked between them, and she seemed to understand without being told. "No, it's not fine," she said gently. "But sometimes truth doesn't come to destroy. It comes to clean." She turned to Daniel. "You of all people should know, rain can wash more than dirt." Her words lingered in the room long after she left. Daniel sat down at the table, staring at the folded letter. The ink had begun to smudge from where his wet hands had touched it. "What do you want me to do with this?" he asked. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "Burn it, if that helps. I already did, 1,000 times in my head." Daniel nodded slowly, then rose. He walked to the fireplace, struck a match, and held it over the paper. The flame flickered, then caught. The letter curled inward, blackening at the edges before collapsing into ash. The room filled with the faint scent of smoke and rain. Sarah watched silently, tears welling but unshed. "I never wanted forgiveness," she said. "I just wanted the truth to stop following me." Daniel turned to her, his face unreadable. "Truth doesn't stop following you," he said. "But maybe, if you stop running, it walks beside you instead." Ranger barked once, a short, sharp sound that broke the heaviness like a heartbeat. Daniel looked down at him, then back at Sarah. "I don't know what happens next," he admitted. "But for Lila's sake, let's not make this house smaller than it already is." Sarah nodded, her voice trembling. "I'll stay, if you'll let me." Daniel hesitated, then said quietly, "For now." Outside, the rain began to ease, softening into mist. The light shifted, fragile and uncertain. But there. Upstairs, Lila called for her father. Daniel turned toward the stairs, pausing just long enough to glance back at Sarah. She stood motionless, staring at the smoke curling above the fireplace, the ashes of her confession rising like a prayer. Ranger lay down between them, tail thumping softly against the floor. The storm outside had finally broken. But inside the house, another kind of storm had only just begun to fade. The next few days passed beneath a sky the color of pewter. The rain had thinned to a slow drizzle that seemed reluctant to leave, as if Cedar Hollow itself needed time to breathe after the storm. The coal house sat quietly on the ridge, its wooden siding glistening with moisture, the yard carpeted in pine needles. Inside, the air felt different, not lighter, but clearer. The truth had cracked something open, and though it hurt to look at, it also allowed the first faint light to seep through. Daniel had been avoiding conversation. He moved through the house with deliberate silence, spending long hours in his study pretending to work, though the papers before him remained untouched. Every sound, the clink of dishes, the scrape of chairs, the slow creak of the stairs, seemed louder than usual, as if the house were waiting for him to speak first. Sarah kept her distance. She cleaned, cooked, and tended to Lila's with quiet care, her movements subdued yet meticulous, as though trying to rebuild the world through order. Her face looked paler than before, framed by strands of damp hair that had escaped her bun. There was a fragility to her now, like a glass lamp burning low but steady. At times, Daniel would glance at her when he thought she wasn't looking and feel a strange ache, not pity, but recognition. He had been living behind walls of his own, and now hers had merely met his halfway. Lila noticed the change too. She had the keen observation of children who have seen too much too soon. One morning, she asked her father if the rain was ever going to stop. Eventually, he said, distracted. But sometimes the earth needs it longer than we want. She nodded, thoughtful. Mom used to say that too, she whispered. Then, after a pause, do you still miss her? The question caught him off guard. Every day, he said softly. But I think she'd want us to find new things to love, even in the rain. Lila smiled faintly, leaning against his arm. Ranger, lying nearby, lifted his head at the sound of Daniel's voice and gave a small, approving huff. That afternoon, Daniel took Lila into town, a rare outing just for the two of them. Cedar Hollow looked washed clean, the sidewalks shining, the shop windows fogged with warmth from inside. They stopped at the diner, where Elsie, the waitress, greeted them with her usual cheer. Elsie was in her 40s, full-figured with rosy cheeks and curly auburn hair, pinned up under a blue kerchief. She had known Daniel since he was a rookie cop, and spoke to him with the easy familiarity of an older sister. Well, look who's come out of hiding, she teased, setting down 2 mugs of cocoa. Your girl's been growing like a weed. Daniel smiled politely. Trying to get her out of the house before we both turn into moss. Elsie laughed, wiping her hands on her apron. Good. The world needs to see you smile again, Cole. It's about time. Her words, casual as they were, stayed with him longer than he expected. As he watched Lila sip her cocoa and talk about school projects, something stirred in him. A warmth he hadn't felt in months. A reminder that being a father wasn't about surviving the past, but showing up for the present. When they returned home, Ranger bounded down the porch steps to greet them, tail wagging. Sarah was in the kitchen, rolling out dough for bread. The smell of yeast and rosemary filled the air. She looked up when Daniel entered, her expression uncertain, as if unsure whether she was allowed to smile. You went into town, she said softly. Lila needed fresh air, Daniel replied. He hesitated, then added, It helped. That night, after Lila went to bed, Daniel found Sarah sitting by the fireplace, mending one of Lila's torn sweaters. The glow of the fire softened her features, making her look almost serene. You don't have to do that, he said quietly. She didn't look up. I know, she murmured, but it keeps my hands busy. When they're still, my thoughts get loud. He nodded, understanding more than he wanted to admit. For a while, neither spoke. The only sounds were the soft pop of the fire and Ranger's steady breathing from the rug. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. I used to think working longer hours would fix everything, he said. That if I built enough walls between me and grief, between me and people, it couldn't touch me anymore. But I was wrong. I wasn't protecting Lila. I was disappearing from her. His voice wavered. When I came home the night Amelia died, she was sitting by the piano, waiting for her mother to play her lullaby. I didn't know what to say, so I just turned off the light. Sarah looked up, eyes glistening. You were doing your best, she said. We all were. We just didn't know how to hold what was left. Daniel exhaled slowly. I don't want to run anymore, he said. From her memory, from my daughter, or from what happened. He turned to look at her. And I don't want you to keep punishing yourself in this house. Sarah's throat tightened. For the first time since she arrived, her eyes filled with tears she didn't hide. I don't know how to stop, she admitted. Every time I try, I see her face. I hear the rain. I feel that moment again. Daniel leaned forward, his tone softer now. Then maybe it's not about forgetting. Maybe it's about letting it live differently. At that moment, Ranger stirred, rising to his feet and padding toward the piano. His paw brushed the pedal, and a single note echoed faintly in the quiet. Both Daniel and Sarah turned to look. The sound lingered in the air like a ghost's sigh, mournful, yet oddly comforting. Daniel walked over, resting his hand on the piano's lid. She used to play every morning, he said. After she got sick, she stopped. I couldn't bring myself to touch it. Again. Sarah stood slowly, her voice trembling. Maybe it's time someone did. He met her eyes. Not tonight, he said gently. But soon. Later, as the house grew quiet, Daniel checked on Lila. She was asleep, curled under her blanket. Ranger at the foot of her bed, like a guardian carved from shadows and light. Daniel knelt, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. She stirred, but didn't wake. He whispered, I'm here now, sweetheart. I'm not going anywhere. When he returned downstairs, Sarah was gone from the living room. He found her on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the mist curling through the trees. I used to love the rain, she said without turning. Before that night, it made everything feel alive. Now I'm learning to hear it again, without fear. Daniel stepped beside her. You will, he said quietly. So will I. They stood there in silence, listening to the soft patter of rain on the porch roof. For the first time in years, Daniel didn't feel the need to fill the silence. The weight between them had shifted, not erased, but transformed into something they could both carry. Inside, the fire crackled softly, and from upstairs came the faint sound of Lila's breathing, steady, peaceful. Ranger padded out onto the porch and sat between them, pressing his head against Daniel's knee. The night smelled of wet cedar and smoke, and though the rain continued to fall, it no longer felt like morning. It felt like renewal. By the time the clouds lifted over Cedar Hollow, the world had begun to thaw. The last of the rainwater dripped from the eaves, pooling in the muddy tracks outside the coal house. The smell of wet pine filled the air, fresh and raw. For the first time in months, sunlight filtered weakly through the branches, a fragile kind of light that seemed to promise more than it could give. Daniel stood on the porch steps, one hand tucked into his jacket pocket, watching the way the light caught on the puddles. He had always found mornings difficult, but this one felt different. There was no sharp ache in his chest, no cold echo in the house behind him, only quiet, gentle, and real. Inside, Lila's laughter carried faintly from the kitchen, where Sarah was showing her how to braid dough for bread. Ranger paced between them, tail wagging lazily. The kitchen smelled of yeast and cinnamon, and even though Sarah still moved with her careful precision, her face had softened these past few days. The lines of worry had eased, replaced by something almost tender. Lila talked more now, about school, her drawings, even the dream she had of her mother sitting under the big oak behind the house. Sarah listened, always patient, her hazel eyes misted with quiet thought. After breakfast, Daniel suggested a walk. The ground's still wet, Sarah warned. Then we'll wear boots, he said, smiling faintly. Lila's face lit up. Can Ranger come? She asked. He'd be mad if he didn't, Daniel replied. The three of them, and Ranger, set out toward the back meadow where the land sloped gently toward the forest. The air was crisp, the earth soft beneath their boots. The meadow was dotted with patches of early wildflowers, bluebells and pale yellow buttercups fighting through the damp soil. At the far edge stood the oak tree, old and massive, its gnarled roots breaking through the ground like ancient veins. It was Amelia's favorite place. She used to sit there with her sketchbook, drawing the clouds that drifted between the mountain peaks. Daniel hadn't been back there since her funeral. When they reached it, he stopped. The wind rustled through the branches, scattering droplets that glistened as they fell. Lila tugged at his sleeve. Can we plant something here? She asked. Mom said flowers like to be near trees. She said roots share secrets. Her words, simple and pure, caught in his throat. He nodded. We can. Sarah watched quietly from a few steps away. She was wearing her gray coat again, though she had taken to leaving it unbuttoned now. Her posture was still careful, but there was a new steadiness in it, not the rigid control of guilt, but the quiet poise of acceptance. When Daniel met her gaze, she smiled. A real smile this time, small and uncertain, but unguarded. Ranger sniffed around the base of the oak, then began to dig. His paws threw up clumps of earth until he unearthed something small, a rusted, metal box half buried under roots. Lila gasped. "A treasure!" she said. Daniel crouched down and brushed away the dirt. The box was old, its hinges stiff with rust. When he pried it open, he found a handful of dried flowers, a smooth river stone, and a folded piece of paper. His chest tightened. The handwriting was Amelia's. Sarah stepped closer, instinctively stopping when she saw his expression. Daniel unfolded the note slowly. The ink had faded, but the words were still clear. For Daniel and Lila. If I don't make it home, plant something beautiful under the oak. Don't let the rain be the only thing that grows here. Daniel exhaled shakily. She must have written this before the last surgery, he said. His voice cracked on the word. Lila looked up at him, her small face full of quiet wonder. Then we should do what she said, she whispered. Sarah knelt beside Lila, brushing a curl from her forehead. What should we plant? She asked. Lila thought for a moment, then said, Sunflowers. They always look like they're talking to the sun. Daniel smiled faintly. Then sunflowers it is. They spent the next hour turning the soil together. Sarah's hands, though delicate, were strong and practiced. She showed Lila how to dig just deep enough for the seeds, how to cover them gently with the back of the hand. Daniel worked beside them, his police jacket off, sleeves rolled, the morning light catching in his graying hair. Ranger lay nearby, his eyes half closed, tail flicking every now and then, as if to mark the rhythm of their labor. When they were done, Sarah stood and brushed the dirt from her palms. There, she said softly. Something new begins. Daniel looked at her, the corners of his mouth lifting. I didn't think I'd ever come back here, he admitted. Thank you for helping me find the courage to. Sarah shook her head. You did that yourself. Lila ran to the tree and hugged its wide trunk, pressing her cheek against the bark. Mom can see it from heaven, she said confidently. She'll be happy. Daniel felt something loosen in his chest, something that had been locked for years. He knelt beside his daughter, pulling her into his arms. Yeah, he murmured, I think she is. As they started back toward the house, Sarah lingered behind for a moment. She placed her palm against the oak's rough bark, her eyes closing. I'm sorry, she whispered, not just to Amelia, but to the part of herself that had been trapped in that night. The wind stirred, gentle and forgiving, brushing her hair across her face. When she turned, Daniel and Lila were waiting for her at the edge of the meadow. Ranger barked once, a short, sharp call, as if reminding her the world was still moving forward. That evening, the light faded to gold. The rain had stopped completely, leaving behind a world washed clean. Daniel sat on the porch steps, watching as Ranger dozed beside him, and Lila sketched in her notebook. Sarah came out with 3 mugs of tea, her sleeves rolled up, her cheeks flushed from the warmth of the kitchen. I didn't know what kind you liked, she said, offering him one. So I made the same for all of us. He smiled. That's probably safest. They sat in companionable silence, the kind that didn't need words. Beyond the porch, the oak tree stood tall against the fading sky, its branches catching the last light. Daniel took a slow sip of his tea and glanced at Sarah. You know, he said, Lila calls you her lucky star. Sarah laughed softly, the sound light and musical. I think she's the one saving me, she replied. Ranger opened one eye, as if to confirm that the statement applied to him too. Daniel reached down and scratched behind his ear. You too, partner. As twilight deepened, Lila looked up from her drawing. Daddy, when the flowers grow, can we bring Grandma Mabel to see them? Daniel nodded. We'll bring everyone, he said, because sometimes the best way to remember someone is to make sure no one forgets to live. And for the first time in a long while, as the porch light flickered on and the crickets began to sing, Cedar Hollow didn't feel like a place of ghosts. It felt like home. Spring unfolded gently over Cedar Hollow, spreading green across the hills and filling the air with the hum of bees and the soft scent of earth. The oak tree behind the coal house had begun to bud again, its branches heavy with promise. Around its roots, the small patch of soil where they had planted sunflower seeds now showed tender shoots pushing bravely through the dirt. Lila checked them every morning before school, crouching low with her braids slipping over her shoulder, whispering encouragements to each tiny sprout. "You're almost there," she would say, her voice barely louder than the rustle of the wind. Inside the house, life had found a rhythm that felt almost like peace. Daniel's patrol shifts were shorter now. He was spending more time at home. Sarah cooked and laughed more easily. And even Ranger had grown softer, lounging near the porch instead of pacing at the windows like he once did. But some nights, when the rain returned and tapped against the roof, Sarah's hands would still tremble faintly as she wiped the counter, her mind wandering to a place Daniel couldn't reach. One of those evenings, when the clouds gathered again over the ridge, Daniel found her sitting at the piano. It hadn't been touched in years, and the keys were slightly yellowed with time. Sarah's fingers hovered uncertainly above them, then pressed one, releasing a note so faint it was almost a memory. "She used to play every Sunday morning," Daniel said quietly from the doorway. Sarah didn't turn. "It's strange," she murmured. "I never met her, yet I feel like she's here in everything, in the smell of bread, in the way Lila hums before she sleeps. It's like she never really left." Daniel nodded slowly. "Maybe that's what love does. It stays in the walls." Just then, Lila came running into the room, clutching an envelope. Her cheeks were flushed, her hands smudged with ink. "Daddy! Miss June gave me this from school." Daniel took the envelope, raising an eyebrow. Miss June was Lila's teacher, a woman in her early 50s, petite with cropped silver hair and a pair of round spectacles that magnified her kind gray eyes. Known for her patience, she had guided generations of children through the tender chaos of learning. Lila adored her. Daniel unfolded the note, expecting a report about homework or grades. Instead, the handwriting made him pause. It wasn't Miss June's careful cursive, but uneven, uncertain. "What is this?" he asked. Lila bit her lip. "It's from the new boy in class. His name's Toby. Miss June helped him write it. He doesn't talk much." Daniel scanned the message. It was short. "Thank you for sitting with me at lunch. My mom says I'm not broken if someone still talks to me." Sarah read over his shoulder, her eyes softening. "That's beautiful," she said. "He must have needed her kindness." Lila nodded seriously. "He cries sometimes. I just sit next to him. He said his dad's gone." Daniel exhaled, the words catching something deep inside him. "Sometimes sitting next to someone is the bravest thing you can do," he said quietly. That weekend, the school organized a small spring fair. Lila begged her parents to come, and Daniel, reluctant but amused, agreed. The schoolyard was alive with color, paper flowers hanging from the fence, children running through the mud, and tables full of baked goods that smelled of sugar and cinnamon. Sarah wore a light blue dress, her hair loose for the first time, the sunlight catching the faint gold in its strands. Daniel hadn't realized until then how young she still was beneath the years of guilt. They found Miss June near the lemonade stand. Her smile widened when she saw them. "Officer Cole, Lila's been our little helper all week," she said warmly. Then she turned to Sarah. "And you must be her mother." Sarah hesitated, but Daniel placed a steady hand on her back. "She's family," he said simply. The words, though small, seemed to steady her. Nearby, a boy stood by the sandbox, watching other children play. His hair was the color of wheat, his clothes a bit too big for his small frame. That was Toby. When he noticed Lila, his face brightened slightly. She waved, and he waved back shyly. A woman approached soon after, his mother, Nora. She was in her 30s, with tired eyes and wind-chapped skin, the kind of woman who carried her weariness gracefully. Daniel noticed how her shoulders curved inward when she spoke, as if bracing herself against the world. Nora smiled at Sarah. "Your daughter's been kind to my boy," she said. "He doesn't talk much since his father passed. Lila's the only one who treats him like he's not strange." Sarah knelt beside Lila, brushing her hair. "Kindness grows where it's watered," she said softly, "and she's had a lot of rain." For the rest of the afternoon, Daniel found himself watching the way Sarah interacted with people, the quiet warmth in her tone, the careful way she listened. It struck him how different she was now from the woman who had arrived months ago, carrying the weight of her silence like a stone. That weight was still there, perhaps, but it no longer crushed her. It had become something she had learned to hold without letting it define her. When the fair ended, they walked home under a lilac sky. Lila fell asleep in the truck, her head resting against Ranger's fur. Daniel drove in silence, but it wasn't the silence of avoidance anymore. It was comfortable, shared. Later that night, after putting Lila to bed, Daniel stepped outside. The moonlight spilled across the porch, soft and pale. The oak tree in the distance stood like a sentinel in silver light, and the small sunflower shoots glimmered faintly under the dew. Sarah joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, "why people who are broken somehow find each other?" Daniel considered that. "Maybe broken people see things whole people can't," he said. "They understand how fragile the world really is." Sarah nodded, then handed him a folded piece of paper. "This came today," she said quietly. It was from the hospital, the same one Amelia had died in. Inside was a notice for a memorial donation made anonymously in Amelia's name. Beneath the printed text, a single handwritten note read, "For every life we couldn't save, let this one be remembered." Daniel looked at Sarah. She met his gaze steadily. "It wasn't me," she said softly. "But I think I know who." He didn't ask. He didn't need to. Somewhere, in the quiet corners of the world, someone else, perhaps another nurse, perhaps Clara, was still trying to make peace with the same ghost. They stood side by side, listening to the night. The air smelled of pine and renewal. Ranger wandered out and sat between them, his breath steady, his amber eyes reflecting the moonlight. Lila's laughter drifted faintly from her dreams upstairs. Sarah exhaled, her voice almost a whisper. "Do you think she forgave me?" Daniel turned to her, his tone low but certain. "Maybe forgiveness isn't something you get," he said. "Maybe it's something you grow." The wind stirred the leaves above them, carrying the scent of blooming lilacs and rain-washed earth. And under that starlit silence, they both understood that some healing came not from forgetting the past, but from letting it take root, like seeds beneath the oak, so it could one day bloom into grace. Summer arrived in Cedar Hollow like a long exhale, warm, patient, and full of small, living noises. The meadows had turned gold, and the air shimmered with heat that made the distant hills look like they were breathing. The sunflowers beneath the oak tree had grown tall, their faces turned toward the sky, strong and bright against the rough bark that guarded them. Every morning, Lila ran out barefoot through the grass to count how many had bloomed. 9 today, she would shout, her laughter carrying through the open windows. Ranger, now grayer around his muzzle, would follow close behind, tail sweeping lazily through the grass. He was older, slower, but his eyes still gleamed with that quiet intelligence that made him more than a dog. He was the silent pulse that held the family together. Daniel watched them from the porch with a mug of coffee in hand. His hair had begun to silver at the temples, and there were faint lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. But those lines spoke more of peace than weariness. For months now, he had been helping build the town's new community center, a small wooden structure near the river, meant to serve as both library and shelter. The work was slow, but it filled him with purpose. Sarah often helped there too, managing supplies and reading to children in the evenings. The townsfolk had grown fond of her. What once had been whispered judgments about the woman who replaced the dead wife had softened into kindness. One afternoon, the mayor of Cedar Hollow, a tall, portly man named Gregory Abbott, stopped by the site. He had a booming voice and a mustache that seemed to move before he did. "Officer Cole," he said, clapping Daniel on the shoulder, "you and your folks have done a fine job here. That woman of yours, what's her name? Sarah? She's got half the town volunteering." Daniel smiled faintly. "That sounds like her." "Well," the mayor continued, "we're having the summer fair next week. I was thinking we ought to dedicate this place then. Bring the whole town together. You in?" Daniel hesitated, looking out at the fields where Sarah and Lila were gathering wildflowers. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "We'll be there." When the day of the fair came, The town square bloomed with color. Paper banners fluttered between lampposts, and the air buzzed with the smell of roasted corn and cinnamon pies. Children ran through the crowd, chasing bubbles that glimmered in the sunlight. Sarah wore a simple cream dress, her hair pinned loosely with a blue ribbon Lila had chosen. She looked lighter that day, the tension in her shoulders replaced by something calm, almost luminous. Lila, wearing her favorite sunflower yellow sundress, skipped at her side, clutching a small envelope tied with twine. "Don't forget," Lila whispered as they walked. "We have to give it to him before the ceremony." Sarah smiled. "I won't forget." The fairgrounds were alive with familiar faces. Miss June from school, still carrying her clipboard and wide smile, Nora and little Toby selling lemonade from a wooden stand, and Elsie, the red-haired waitress, laughing with a group of neighbors near the pie contest booth. It felt as if the whole town had come to witness the unveiling of something larger than the building itself, a quiet return to life after too much silence. When the ceremony began, Mayor Abbott stepped up to the small wooden stage. "Folks," he said, voice carrying over the hum of the crowd, "today we dedicate this place not just to Cedar Hollow, but to the people who remind us what community really means. Officer Daniel Cole and his family," he paused, glancing toward Daniel, Sarah, and Lila, "showed us that strength isn't about building walls. It's about knowing when to open your doors again." Applause rippled through the crowd. Daniel's face flushed slightly. He wasn't used to being at the center of anything, but when he looked at Sarah, she gave him a nod that steadied him. Lila squeezed his hand. After the speeches ended, Sarah led Lila to the oak tree by the edge of the fairgrounds, the same one where, months earlier, they had planted the sunflowers. Daniel followed quietly. The air had begun to shift. The heavy scent of rain was in it again, that old familiar promise. Sarah turned to Daniel and pressed the envelope into his hand. "From both of us," she said softly. He untied the string. Inside was a letter written in Lila's careful, looping handwriting. "Dear Mom, we planted your flowers and they grew tall. We're happy now. Daddy smiles every day. Miss Sarah says the rain helps things grow, so if it rains today, we'll think it's you watering them." Daniel's throat tightened. The first raindrops began to fall, soft, almost hesitant, like a benediction. Sarah reached out, taking his hand. The rain grew steadier, dappling the petals of the sunflowers, darkening the soil around their roots. Lila threw her arms up, laughing as the drops landed on her cheeks. Ranger barked once, circling her, his fur slick with water. By the time the fair ended, the town had turned into a blur of umbrellas and laughter. People danced barefoot in the mud, children splashing puddles that reflected the lights strung across the square. And through it all, Daniel and Sarah stood beneath the oak, watching the rain fall the way it once had in their memories. No longer something to fear, but something that cleansed. That night, after everyone had gone home, Daniel and Sarah walked back through the quiet streets with Lila, asleep in his arms, and Ranger padding beside them. The moon glowed faintly through the thinning clouds. "You ever think," Daniel said, his voice low, "that maybe the rain was never meant to take from us, but to give something back?" Sarah looked up at him, her expression soft. "Maybe that's how forgiveness works," she said. "It doesn't erase what happened. It just makes room for something new to grow." When they reached home, Lila stirred in his arms, half dreaming. "Daddy," she mumbled, "do you think Mom saw the flowers?" Daniel kissed her forehead. "I know she did, sweetheart." He carried her to bed and stayed there a long while, watching her sleep. Sarah stood in the doorway, her eyes reflecting the golden light from the hallway. Downstairs, the house was filled with the smell of wet earth and tea leaves. The sound of the rain had become softer, almost like breathing. Sarah poured 2 cups and set one before him. "You kept your promise," she said. "You came back." Daniel met her gaze. "We both did." Outside, the rain eased into a whisper. The oak tree swayed gently, its roots deep and strong. Beneath it, the sunflowers glistened in the moonlight, their petals heavy with rain but unbowed. Ranger curled up on the porch, letting out a satisfied sigh. In that moment, Cedar Hollow no longer carried the echo of loss. It carried the sound of renewal, and as Daniel reached across the table to take Sarah's hand, he realized something simple and profound, that love, like rain, was never meant to stay contained. It would always find its way through cracks, through grief, through guilt, through fear, until it found the earth ready again to bloom. Sometimes God's greatest miracles are not found in thunder or lightning, but in the quiet moments when hearts choose to forgive. The rain that once brought sorrow to this family became the very water that helped love grow again. That is how God works, turning pain into purpose and storms into seeds of grace. In our own lives, we all face seasons of rain. But if we let faith guide us, those storms can cleanse our hearts and make room for something beautiful to bloom. So, today, wherever you are, take a moment to thank God for the rain that shaped you. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment below, subscribe for more stories of faith and love, and may God bless you and your family with peace, healing, and new beginnings. Type Amen in the comments if you believe that even after the hardest storms, God still makes the sun rise again.